Hi everyone, Kerry here, and this is actually going to be a series of videos that I'm going to do on how to build your very own BB-8 or BB-9E. Now the units that we're going to be building are actually 1-to-1 scale. So what that means is they are exactly the same size as what you'd see in the movies. We're going to do everything from putting together the skeleton, printing out panels, how to properly finish things, doing electronics, everything that you need to know. So by the time that we're done with this series of videos, you can have your very own BB-8 or BB-9E. In this first video, we're going to cover putting together the skeleton, prepping it, finishing it, and getting it ready for the next step. So please watch the entire video, then go back and actually start doing some of the steps. From this point, we're going to head on into the video. Happy building, take your time, and we'll see you at the end of the video. Before assembling the skeleton, there's a few different things you're going to want to make sure that you have. Some sort of super glue. I actually prefer the Gorilla Glue, works well. For assembly, even though they're a 3mm nut, I like the 7/32 wrench. I think that's just a preference thing. I like it because it's easy to get on and off, but it doesn't seem to strip out the nut easy. And we're really not putting that much torque on them anyhow. This is a 2.5mm Allen wrench. And then you're going to need a piece of wire. And use, this is an 18 gauge piece of actual wire. Don't use anything that stretches. And I'll tell you why here in just a minute. But this you're actually going to cut to 1,589 millimeters long. And what that is the skeleton, when completed, we want to have it a 506 millimeter diameter. Well, the 1,589 millimeters is the circumference around that. And we're going to be using this to test our skeleton before we glue it. You're going to want to have some tape. Doesn't need a lot. And then a file or a piece of sandpaper. So the skeleton kit's going to come with 12 of the injection molded pieces, nuts, washers, screws, and pennies, and those you'll actually be using to put everything together. So what we need to do is, the first thing we're going to do a dry fit, or a dry build as it were, of the actual skeleton itself. And what we're looking for is we're looking to make sure the diameter is exactly what it should be. Now, because these are injection molded piece, they're very, very accurate, but every once in a while on, say, one of the end pieces, there's different slides and things that come in when the piece is built. Maybe there's a little bit of plastic right here, or a little bit of flashing or something like that. And what you're going to want to do is you're going to want to take your file or sandpaper and just remove any little bit of plastic that is on that edge. Once you've gone through and just done a quick check on all these pieces, we're going to go ahead and do the dry assembly. Now, that's pretty simple. There are slots for the pennies. Those drop into place. And then you just simply slide the bolt through. Oops, get my fingers in there. And then put the nut on, and then just continue the process all the way around. Like so, just bolt it together. And like I said, continue all the way around until you actually have a completed skeleton. Now, one of the things that you will notice is that the pennies are actually, some of them or most of them are actually loose fit in the slots themselves. So it will rattle at this point. It'll make some noise. That's totally normal. When I designed the skeleton and I had to come up with a dimension for these slots for the pennies, one of the things that I found after measuring a lot of pennies is that they all vary in size by a slight amount. So I had to go to the side of maybe a little bit thicker pennies, so that way if we did have a thick one, it'd still fit in the hole. So it doesn't really matter, because what happens when we do the actual assembly, these get glued in anyhow, and that takes away any rattle. So like I said, first thing you're going to do is go through and complete the entire skeleton to this point here. Next, if you haven't done so already, you're going to want to print just a couple of these rib pieces. Make sure you do print the ones that are made for the V2 skeleton, because they're slightly different than the V1 injection skeleton. It's just dimensional things. And at the same time, one of the things I did do, and it was another member's suggestion, which turned out to be great, was rather than having a screw come through here, which is what it used to have, it's just a piece of printed plastic now. So it holds in the exact same, but it simplifies the actual build of everything and the printing process as well. So these guys you'll just slide into here. Make sure that they're pressed all the way in. Now, this is where our piece of wire is going to come in handy. Oh, one quick thing that I wanted to note. When you're bolting everything together, make sure that these three pieces are flush to each other, because there is a slight amount of play, call it 0.5 millimeter of play, between the pieces due to tolerances, due to you need to have enough room to put the screw through, the pennies and things like that. There is the ability for them to rise or dip just slightly to each other. Make sure that all these are flat, because if they're not flat, that will actually throw your dimension off, because it will allow the skeleton to grow a tiny bit, for lack of better words. So after you get all them flat, what you want to do is just take your tape. We're going to take our piece of wire, pick a center point, and just tape it on. And then we'll just work our way around the skeleton. Now, as you go around, what you want to do is you want to make sure that you pull it tight. And this is one of the reasons why I said make sure you use a piece of wire, like speaker wire or electrical wire or something like that. You want it to be flexible, but it can't stretch. And if you use something like a piece of string and it stretches, then what's going to happen is it's going to throw off your measurement, because it'll fit perfect, but you're actually not that same measurement. Also, make sure that the ribs are pressed all the way down in, because if these are lifted up at all, it's going to throw your measurement off as well. And just work your way around. I did find that holding the wire back here while you pull it tight actually helps out quite a bit, because otherwise sometimes the wire will want to pull through the tape. And this is just a temporary check anyhow. So this one I have not sanded or anything. And just from a quick look, I'm probably, I don't know, 1 millimeter or so. Let me actually take this up to the camera and see if we can get that in the shot. They're probably, I don't know, maybe 1 millimeter apart. And the more that you are apart, or the bigger the gap, the more gaps you're going to have between your panels, because that means you're actually not 506 millimeters diameter, which is what the club panels are spec'd at, but you're actually 507 or 505 or some number. So the goal in the end is to get these guys to touch. Now, if you're within about 1 millimeter, like I am, I would call that really good, and I would stick with that. And the reason why is I could have, like I said, like I have a little bit of a raised surface right here. So one of the things we're going to do after everything's assembled anyhow is we're going to do a light sanding on the body. And what that does is that keeps, when you have the plastic outer panels on the frame, if they're rubbering or moving, by sanding it just slightly, what it does is it gives it kind of a leathery finish, for lack of better words, and it takes away any noise you might have of panel on panel. So being 1 millimeter, a little bit larger here, perfectly fine. At this point, I would be good to go as far as pulling it apart and doing the final assembly. One of the things to note is if you do have a larger gap, like I said, 1 millimeter is probably okay. If you're in 2, 3, 4 millimeters, then you definitely have something going on in these joints. And what you want to do is you want to take it apart. Look, or actually first, you could look and you'd be able to see where the gaps are. Take those portions apart, sand them, put it back together and get everything to fit right. For the most part, these things fit nearly exact every single time. Once you get your dimension correct here, what you're also going to want to do is rotate the ribs and run it in the other direction as well. And that can be done in a few different directions. And the reason why is if you've got 506 or the 1589 millimeters this way and it's perfect, but you don't bother to check this way and it's not perfect, then you still have issues. So run through, check at this dimension, run through, check at that dimension, adjust and sand as needed. And then once you have all that done, at that point, you're ready to take it apart, and we'll go on to the next step of actually doing a final assembly. So for the first step in assembling the skeleton, what we need to do is we actually need to glue some of the pennies into some of the joints. So what you want to do is you're going to want to take a look at, there's 4 different slots on each end. Now when we glue them in, what we want to do is we want to glue, say, these 2 slots, which would be on my right side, and then when we roll the piece over, the next 2 pennies we want to put on the right side as well. So when they're fully glued in, what you'll see is that they are actually opposite of one another, and that's what we're actually shooting for. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start with one end of the skeleton piece, and I'll take my glue and I'll put it just down into the slot where the penny is going to go. And I want to put a decent amount in there, but not so much that it comes gooping out all over the actual skeleton piece. And then I'll take the pennies and I'll push them into place. And then usually what I'll do is I will kind of put them in and out just a tiny bit, just make sure that they're coated really well. Now, one of the critical things here is to get all the extra glue off the outside from around the pennies, not only including on the pennies themselves, but on the skeleton piece. I talked earlier about how if there's anything down in the gap between the skeleton pieces, what'll happen is it'll actually create a gap and increase the overall diameter of the skeleton. So take your time, clean up around the pennies, make sure that it is absolutely clean, 0 glue on the outside. And there's no rush in doing this. If you do find that you have some glue that dried on the outside surface or on this edge of the skeleton, you're going to need to take a razor blade or a knife or something and get that off of there. By the time you usually clean this up, the glue itself, at least this glue, has already started to set up a bit. Matter of fact, these are pretty much set. But I don't want to mess with them too much. So what I'll do is I will set this aside. I'll take care of the entire pile of 12 pieces, and then I'll go back and I'll glue in the opposite side. So next thing I did was I went through, I got all the pennies glued into one end, did all 12 pieces, then I waited a little bit and I flipped it over and I did the other side. That just made sure that the first side was dry enough so they didn't slip or move while I was working on the second side. One of the important things to note is that when you're looking at the pennies in the slot, you'll notice that the slot's a little bit wider in the penny. That's just to make it easier for the final assembly. One of the things to make sure that you do, though, is push the pennies all the way down in while you're gluing them. Otherwise, if they stick up a tiny bit, they may keep the different pieces of the skeleton from fitting together properly. At this stage, the next thing we're going to do is we're actually going to glue these into a 3-piece triangle that's going to look like this. Now, what you want to do is you're going to go through and you're going to use just the screws and the nuts, put them together in a triangle piece without doing any glue yet. So let's go ahead and do that and we'll go on to the next part. So at this point, what I've done is I have this loosely assembled. So they're not tightened down yet. And what I want to do is I'm tightening them down is just slowly work my way around. So I don't want to tighten them yet. What I want to do is snug them up just slightly so they can still move. And then work your way around. And the reason why we're doing this is what we're trying to do is we're trying to get all 3 joints to pull themselves equally into position. If you tighten one side down a lot, and it's out of position, it'll hold really well, and then the next piece won't be able to get into the proper position. So just work your way around and get everything snugged up. Like so. What we're looking for is we're looking to make sure that in this joint itself, you can't see any light through it. Everything's nice and tight, it all fits flush, and that tells us that we didn't have any buildup on the edge when we did our penny gluing. Now, the main reason why we're doing this is when we go to glue the different pieces together, this helps with the alignment of the pieces. If you were to take just the 2 pieces and put them together, because there are tolerances, like the play in the penny itself, these can move just a tiny bit. So if you're off by, say, 1/2 millimeter, these are glued together now. You didn't bother to do the alignment prior. And then you go to glue this guy in, what you end up with is a gap. And that gap is what's going to create problems later on, because every little tiny bit around the skeleton allows it to grow, which means your panels won't fit properly. So after you get it pre-assembled and tested like this, what you're going to do is you're going to take off one of the sides, and that's the side that we're going to glue first. Now, excuse me, I did find that putting the glue on the portion that doesn't have the pennies is actually the easiest. When you do the glue, make sure that you stop at the edge of the penny slot right there. Don't run it all the way to the corner, because the glue itself tends to squish out a little bit, and that'll actually get down into this portion, which will make it harder to get the third piece glued in here in a little bit. So we're going to do exactly like we did before. We're just going to go ahead and put some down in the slot. Don't do too much because we don't want it squishing out everywhere, but we do want enough so that way it holds properly. And then we're also going to cover the face as well. Now on this portion is where you actually have to work kind of fast. Get that put in. What you want to do before you put the nut on is wipe it, make sure that your joint is flat. And then through this other one, just get your screw into place at first. Make sure that, once again, everything is aligned and that you're working your way around. Check your heights on your joint, make sure that they're flush. And tighten that one side down really good. Yeah, it's pretty good actually. No light gaps. That actually worked out perfect. It's nice and flush as well. So that's exactly what we're looking for right there. It should almost look like there's no glue in there, even though there is. So at that point, what we're going to do is do one joint on all 4 pre-assemblies, and then we'll go back to taking apart the next one and gluing that one as well. Now that you have the first portion of the assembly done, we have one joint that's been glued. Give it some time to dry. Even though most of the glues say 10-second setup time, it actually takes a lot longer when it's down in a joint with no air. So give it some time to dry. What I did was I did the 4 pre-assemblies, and by the time you get that done, you're 10 minutes into it. I'll go back and start on the next portion. Now what we need to do is we need to remove the portion of the skeleton that hasn't yet been glued. So it may sound like a strange thing to say, but always make sure that you have enough glue for the next step. It would really be bad to get part way through gluing up a joint and figure out that you run out of glue, because at that point you have no choice. You're at a point of no return. You just have to screw it together and hope for the best. So at this point, what we need to do is we're going to glue these 2 surfaces so that we can put the third piece on. I do find that it's best just to glue here, and at this point we do want to get all the way down into the joint down here in the center. But I do find it's easier just to do this entire surface and including on top of the pennies so that it gets down to the joint of the next piece, rather than trying to glue this one and then glue this one and then put it together. So like I said, I do want to put quite a bit on top of the pennies themselves, that way it soaks that joint and they get good adhesion down in there. And you notice I've left the screws partway in. Just makes it a lot easier to position when we get to this step. And in the ease of saving time, or just to save time, usually what I'll do is I'll start with this, and then I'll switch and I'll go to my little drill. I've got it in a really low torque setting though, because I don't want to take a chance of breaking a screw or something like that. Once again, tighten both joints slightly. Make sure that everything's positioned right. And once you verify that everything looks good, then go ahead and snug it down. That's it. Wipe down the extra glue and this piece is done as well. Go ahead and repeat for the other 4 pieces, or the other 3 pieces, for a total of 4. And then after you're done with that, we'll come back and we'll talk about the next portion of the assembly. So at this point you should have a total of 4 of these triangular pieces that you've built, which are all glued and screwed together at the joints. From this point we have to do another assembly, and what that is taking 3 of those pieces you just built and attaching them at this point. So you'll end up with something like this. Now don't worry about these portions yet, screwing them down. We'll get to that in a minute. But this needs to be glued and attached the exact same way as we needed these. So what you'll do is you'll bolt the 3 together, check to make sure that everything is smooth, make sure that you don't have gaps in here. And then what you want to do is you'll take off the one side, you'll glue where the pennies go, you'll assemble it, wait till it dries, take apart the 3rd side and do that. So it's the exact same thing as you just did right here, just in a slightly larger version of the assembly. So at this point I have this joint is fully glued and I'm ready to go on to the last couple joints. So one of the things that you may want to do is grab some masking tape and mark off on your final triangle piece that isn't assembled yet or isn't glued yet, put a little bit of tape on the corners. Now you could also do this with a Sharpie or something. As a matter of fact, you're going to want to mark it with a Sharpie later on. But as a temporary, I like just putting a little bit of tape here. The reason why is the next thing we're going to do is we're going to glue together these final 3 joints. But you don't want to glue this one on ever, because this is the panel that you'll remove to go ahead and get your drivetrain in and out. So I just do this to make sure that I remind myself, don't glue this joint. So at this point, go through and screw everything together just like we have all the other pieces. And then we'll take it apart and glue that last final joint on the 3 sides, just like we did on all the other triangular pieces, by bolting this together and making sure that all the alignment's right. Then pull this off and glue that piece. So now what I've done is I've gone through and I've screwed together all the different joints I just talked about, making one complete skeleton. I then went back and just undid the one corner, because this is going to be the last glue joint on this portion that we'll actually put together. Now remember that I went through and I put tape on here to make sure I don't accidentally put glue here and bond the entire thing together. So I found with this, just take a portion of the skeleton and just tuck it behind the other part just to kind of make it get out of the way. Otherwise you'll be fighting it with both hands while you're trying to glue at the same time, and it just doesn't work. Once again on this joint, make sure that you don't go beyond the penny as far as where you're putting the glue, because you don't want it to get onto this portion here at all. We only want to glue the one joint that is not taped. Just like all the other joints that we did, make sure that you take your time and get this nice and aligned and flush. At this point, this joint is done, and I'm going to go on and finish the other two. So at this point, the assembly of the skeleton is done. All the joints are glued. You'll notice that the penny is no longer rattle. And we're going to go on and do just a couple more small steps. One of them is sanding the skeleton, and that's because even on mine, no matter how careful I was, I did have one or two joints that are off by just a tiny bit, because the glue dried before I had a chance to fully get them into place. The other thing that I'm going to be doing is, if you're using my drivetrain, I actually have transducers that go on the outer body panels of BB-8 and BB-9E, which is what allows my units to be so loud. You could actually hear them in a Comic-Con. And in order to do that, we end up making a hole through the actual skeleton itself to allow the transducers to be directly attached to the triangle pieces. So that'll be something else that we'll do. So let's go ahead and go on to those steps now. So this next portion may or may not make you cringe a little bit, depending upon how dedicated you are to getting the best BB-8 you possibly can. If you're using my drive system, and as far as I know it's the only one this works with so far, what I usually do is I actually make a hole through the end of the skeleton, and there's a transducer that gets mounted on the actual outside triangle. And what this does is, the way the transducer works is it works by vibrating the surface it's connected to. So if you connect a transducer on the inside of the skeleton, by definition we want the skeleton to be as stiff as possible, so the stiffer it is, the less the transducer is going to work. Whereas we actually have the triangle panels, which are just kind of floating on the outside, so it's the perfect opportunity to make those into a speaker. So what I've done is I've developed a way to float the transducer on the actual triangle itself. It doesn't touch the skeleton, it doesn't touch the axle or anything on the inside. I actually have a special hub that I designed which allows the transducer to float inside. So may make you cringe a little bit, but if you want the best sound, this is the way to go about doing it. So what we're going to do is you're going to take the two different portions that you have, and what I mean by that is you have one which was a very large portion, and then another one which is your removable triangle. Now this is my removable piece here, and how I know is I just took Sharpie and drew an arrow. And you're going to want to do this not only now, but later on when you pull off panels, it's kind of hard to figure out which one needs to be removed or which direction you have to go in to get this entire piece out, because you have to pull off a certain amount of panels. So what I'm going to do is, in the end, the axle, if you look at this, is my removable piece. The axle is going to be mounted in the center of that and the center of the opposite side, so here and here. So what you're going to need to do is put a hole through those two spots. So I start out by just using a pilot hole, and then a 2.25 inch hole saw. This is what will do the main portion of my hole, and then after that there's a small notch that's actually cut out as well for the transducer. I have a template which you could download, and this not only shows the 2.25 inch but also shows the little cutout. The little cutout I usually just do with the Dremel, pretty easy. And once you're done with this, this will give you clearance. So what you want to do is you want to start by drilling the pilot hole, then do the 2.25 inch hole, take a Sharpie, draw where the notch goes, and then just cut that out. And if you look here, there's 3 different circles. Those are actually where the axle bolts are, so you have an orientation for it. So at this point, I'm going to go ahead and do that and see how it turns out. So we'll start out by making our pilot hole in the middle of our removable panel. So here's one joint, second joint, third joint, So I know that this right here is where I want to go. And you just want to go right in between where the three different pieces meet together. I do the pilot hole just to make sure that when we do the hole saw, it's centered. Otherwise, it's pretty hard to get the drill bit exactly where you want on a hole saw. Yeah, and there's the first one. You'll flip it over and do the exact same thing on the other side. It's as simple as that. And you can actually see right here where we cut through the pennies. So what I did was I took the transducer template and used an X-Acto knife and just cut it out. So at this point what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a few different screws and simply align the holes in the template with the holes in the skeleton. Like so. And that gives you an area that you want to color in with a Sharpie or something. And that's the area that you'll actually cut out using a Dremel or something else. And it's just a little bit of relief, and what that is for the connector portion of the transducers, they have room to move around. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my Dremel and I'm going to notch out this little section that we drew with the template just a few minutes ago. Now that that's notched out, I'll just go through with a file and just clean everything up. And then on the back side, I'll actually use an X-Acto knife just to clean up any extra loose plastic and stuff like that. And that's all you have to do to prep it for the transducers. Now that we have the holes cut for the transducers, the very last thing we're going to do is a really light sanding on the skeleton. Now, once again, we're not trying to change the diameter of it. If you do a really light sanding, what it does is it helps when you bolt the other panels on to keep them a little bit quieter. It actually damps the sound a little bit of the panels themselves. If you go too far, there's certain things on the skeleton, like these areas here, which actually I'll show you later on. We put servo extender wires down in there, and that's how we connect on our body LEDs. So you don't want to sand a lot, because otherwise this won't be deep enough. What we're trying to do also, aside from slight scuffing, is if there's any areas, like here, there's a real slight ridge where all these guys meet, and that's just from the glue sticking up a little bit. And at the same time, the plastic pieces, at the very end of them, it just flares up just a hair, I don't know, 1/10 of a millimeter, something really small. So what we want to do is just sand this area, get rid of the high spots, do a real light scuff on the entire skeleton, and then you'll be good to go for putting on body panels. So because I don't want to create the dust in my room where my printers are, I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit and then come back and show you on the video. So what I've done at this point is I've gone around the skeleton and I've sanded all the joints. And I've intentionally left this one not quite done. And what you'll notice is these two joints, which are done correctly, there's no shiny plastic on either side of the joint. It kind of all looks the same. That means that these two surfaces are even with one another. This one, what you'll notice is there's a little bit of black shiny plastic still right here. And what that means is this side is slightly lower than this side. So I'm going to want to go back and hit this area just to help blend this out a little bit, make sure we don't have any high spots. Will this actually hold up your triangle panels at this point? Probably not, but taking it down even certainly can't hurt. I did this with 80 grit sandpaper. The rest of the skeleton I'm actually going to hit with probably 120 grit or maybe 220 grit, and that's just to scuff it up. And so like I talked about earlier, so that way the panels on the outside don't make any noise against this plastic. Now the odds of that happening are really low. Would you ever hear it in a Comic-Con? No, no way. But at the same time, I'm a bit of a perfectionist by nature, so I'm going to go ahead and do it. Like I said, just be careful not to take down too much because you don't want to reduce the depth of these, which are actually the tracks for your servo wires. So at this point, I've gone through and I've sanded the skeleton everywhere. And the object, like I said, was just to simply scuff the surface, not to reduce the size. So you'll notice I still have shiny spots everywhere, and that's because I didn't want to go too far. You'll also see that I put the ribs back in and I've run my wire around it again. And the reason why is I wanted to do one final check before I called the skeleton done. Now, if you remember from the beginning portion, I had about a 1mm gap before I actually went through and glued everything and sanded it. Now, let's see if I can get this in the camera. But you'll see that now the gap is somewhere in the neighborhood of 0.1, 0.2 millimeters. As a matter of fact, it's a little bit of an overlap, not a gap anymore. So I'd actually have to call that just about perfect. So from a skeleton standpoint, the assembly is done, and we go on to the next step. So that's all there is to assembling and prepping the skeleton. It's actually a pretty easy process. From beginning to end, it'll probably take you somewhere in the neighborhood of a half a day. So it's pretty fast as well. So that'll do it for this video. The next video, we're actually going to concentrate on printing out the panels and starting the finishing process. So if you like what you saw, or if you'd like to build your very own BB-8 or BB-9E, please subscribe to my YouTube channel. Otherwise, happy building, and we'll see you at a show.